If you learn Russian, you can have bears as friends. Maybe you've already tried learning Russian but gave up at greetings like "Здравствуйте", finding that r tough to pronounce, or getting annoyed because Russians don't pronounce words exactly as they're written, like French.
Здравствуйте. Здравствуйте. Здравствуйте.
值得拉夫斯的维基。
And maybe your knowledge of Russian is only limited to
Сука, блядь!
If that's the case, this video is for you. So, Russian is actually a pretty major global language. It's spoken by around 253 to 260 million people worldwide. Out of that, somewhere between 116 and 154 million speak it as their first language, which easily puts Russian in the top 10 most spoken languages on the planet. Of course, it's the official language in Russia, but it's also used officially in places like Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, especially in schools and government stuff. But it doesn't stop there. Even in countries where Russian isn't officially recognized anymore, like Ukraine, Moldova, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and even parts of the Baltics and Israel, it still sticks around as the go-to language for communication between people from different backgrounds. It's kind of a leftover from the Soviet era, when Russian was taught everywhere and used as the main language across the region. Even though the USSR is long gone, that legacy hasn't really disappeared. People still use Russian to talk across ethnic or language lines in many of those countries. It's a great example of how language spreads not just through migration, but through politics, education, and history. The roots of the Russian language go all the way back 4,000 to 6,000 years. Yep, we're talking ancient Indo-European times. Fast forward to around 500 AD, and the early Slavic tribes in Eastern Europe developed their own branch of language, called Proto-Slavic. That Proto-Slavic eventually split into three big groups: Southern Slavic like Serbian and Bulgarian, Western Slavic like Polish and Czech, and Eastern Slavic, which became the ancestor of Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian. In the 9th century, two Christian missionaries, Saint Cyril and Methodius, showed up and dropped Old Church Slavonic, basically the literary and religious starter pack for Slavic people. That move gave the early Slavs a shared writing system and religious language, which helped hold things together linguistically. Jump to the late 1600s, and here comes Peter the Great, who was all about making Russia more modern and Western. Under his rule, Russian started absorbing words and ideas from Western European languages: French, German, Dutch, you name it. Think of it as Russia's major rebrand era. Before things got standardized, Russian was kind of a linguistic patchwork. Why? Because the country was huge with tons of different regions and dialects. There was also a long period of Mongol rule and feudal fragmentation, which made unifying the language even harder. Luckily, that early Old Church Slavonic helped a lot in creating a shared literary base. Later, leaders like Peter the Great and eventually the Soviet government pushed hard for a more standardized, unified version of Russian, especially in education, media, and governance. After World War II, things escalated quickly. The Soviet Union expanded its influence, and with that came the widespread teaching of Russian, not just in Russia, but across all the Soviet republics and even Eastern Bloc countries. If you went to school in places like Kazakhstan, Ukraine, or East Germany in the 1950s to 80s, chances are you were learning Russian. This strategic push helped cement Russian's role as a major international language, both politically and culturally. You might think that because Russia is huge, like crazy huge, the Russian language would have tons of wild dialects that are totally different from each other. But actually, Russian is surprisingly consistent across the country. There are differences, sure, but compared to a lot of other big languages like, say, Chinese, Arabic, Russian has way fewer extreme variations. And that's mostly thanks to history, especially during the Soviet era, when the government really pushed for one standard version of the language, the one based on Central Russian, especially the dialect spoken in Moscow. So Northern Russian dialect spoken mostly north of Moscow. The big thing here is okanye, where people clearly pronounce unstressed os, unlike the rest of Russia where they usually turn into an A sound.
Поэтому возьмите этот, как ее.
Another quirk is tsokanye, where the letter ch is pronounced more like ts. I wonder if this has anything to do with tsokanye of Khalkha dialect, because they pronounce tsagan instead of chagan. Now head south of Moscow to places like Tula, Ryazan, or Oryol, and things change. Here you will hear akanye, where unstressed o and ye turn into a. So words sounds a bit more flattened, like malako. There's also yakanye, where certain vowels turn into this soft e sound. One of the most unique features is something called gekanye, where the usual g sound becomes a fricative r.
Дорога, голова, подготовка.
So Central Russian dialect is spoken in between the northern and southern zones, and yep, Moscow sits right in the heart of it. It mixes features from both sides. You get akanye like in the south, but none of that strong okanye or gekanye. It's the base for Standard Russian, which is taught in schools, used in media, and heard across the country. Now let's talk about the Russian alphabet, or at least what we think is the Russian alphabet, because it turns out it's not really Russian at all. It actually started much farther south, in the Balkans, not Russia. Back in the 9th century, in what's now known as the First Bulgarian Empire, two brothers, Cyril and Methodius, were on a mission, literally. They were Byzantine missionaries sent to spread Christianity to the Slavic peoples, and they needed a way to translate the Bible into a language locals could actually understand. So they invented an alphabet. Not Cyrillic yet, but something called Glagolitic, a wild, complex script that looked nothing like Greek or Latin. But it was hard to use, so Cyril's students came up with something simpler, something closer to Greek. And that became Cyrillic, a clean, readable alphabet designed specifically to fit Slavic sounds that Greek just couldn't handle. Fast forward to 988 CE, the moment when Kievan Rus converted to Christianity. Along with priests and rituals came something else, books, written in the Cyrillic script, imported straight from Bulgaria. The earliest Cyrillic looked a lot like Greek Anshul, all uppercase, no lowercase, no italics, no frills. It was slow to evolve, partly because it was holy. It wasn't just writing, it was scripture, and that meant it had to stay consistent. Most people today, especially in the West, think of Cyrillic as something Russian. But that's not because Russia invented it. It's because Russia got big, like superpower during the Cold War big. With a huge population, global reach, and a spot at the United Nations, Russian became one of the most recognized languages in the world. And with that came the global assumption that the alphabet is Russian. Just like in branding, the name that sticks isn't always the one that invented the product. Let's zoom in on a moment when language got redesigned, not just by scholars, but by emperors and revolutionaries. Because in Russia, changing the alphabet has never been just about spelling, it's about power. In the early 1700s, Peter the Great looked at Russia and decided it needed a full-on makeover. He wanted to modernize. He went to Europe and said,
I see it, I like it, I want it, I got it, yeah.
He did get to turn his country into a European-style empire. And that didn't just mean building navies or changing fashion. It meant changing how people wrote. So between 1708 and 1710, Peter launched a radical reform of the Cyrillic alphabet. He introduced what he called the civil script, Гражданский шрифт. It stripped out a bunch of archaic characters, cutting the alphabet down from 45 to 36 letters. He added new letters like E and I, cleaned up the typefaces, and crucially made the shapes look a lot more like Latin letters. The idea was, if Russia was going to be a modern power, its writing needed to look modern too. But he didn't touch everything. Peter left the old script, known as Polustav, intact for religious texts. So now Russia had two scripts, one for the state and one for the church. Fast forward to 1917, the Russian Revolution. A new government takes over, one that wants to wipe the slate clean. And part of that process, you guessed it, change the alphabet again. The Bolsheviks weren't just fighting the Tsar, they were fighting elitism, illiteracy, and complexity. So they launched the second major orthographic reform. Out went the old letters. Yat replaced by ye, fita became fe. They also scrapped the hard sign at the end of words, a letter that didn't make a sound but took up space. It stuck around in the middle of words where it actually matters for pronunciation. The goal? Make Russian easier to read, easier to learn, and most importantly, more accessible to the masses. This demonstrates how language standardization and orthographic changes can function as powerful instruments for social engineering and political control, reflecting profound ideological shifts rather than purely linguistic revolution. Anyway, the Russian alphabet now has 33 letters, and honestly, it's not that bad to learn. One of the nice things about it is that most letters match up pretty cleanly with one sound. That means when you're reading Russian, the words usually sound like how they're spelled, even if you have no clue what they actually mean. Sounds easy, right? Well, here comes the plot twist. In Russian, word stress is all over the place. It's not like Spanish or French, where you can kind of guess which syllable to stress. In Russian, it can fall anywhere in the word, and where the stress goes can completely change how it sounds, or even what it means. For example, "Я плачу" means I'm paying. "Я плачу", however, means I'm crying. Yep, same spelling, different stress, totally different meaning. Even most AI can't get it right. As a human, you love rhythms and most importantly, consistent rules. But the stress patterns can be irregular with conjugations. Take call as an example. Я звоню, ты звонишь, and for past tense, звонил, звонила, звонили, all stress patterns on I. But for писать, я пишу, and you think it's пишешь, but it's пишешь. So for past tense, you think it's писал, but it's писал because писал is past tense for another word. Normally, Russian texts are without stress marks, so in writing, it makes things even more ambiguous. It's kind of like a little bit Chinese and a little bit of Spanish. In Chinese, when you got the tone wrong, the meaning changes. And you have to remember the conjugated forms of the word like in Spanish. And then there's vowel reduction. If a vowel isn't stressed, it gets kind of lazy and mumbly. Like the letter O when unstressed, it doesn't sound like O at all. It turns into something more like A. This is called akanye. For example, молоко is молоко and not молоко. Gora is gora, not gora. I mean, it makes sense because otherwise gora is tiring to pronounce and sounds like you're yelling. And people prefer things to be simpler, and I guess this works for every type of evolution. And ye and I do something similar as well. That's called ikanye. For example, ученик is pronounced ученик, not ученик. It all just kind of blends together when it's not stressed. Russian also has these two weird little letters, the soft sign and the hard sign. They don't have sounds of their own. They just change how the letter before them is pronounced. Think of the soft sign like adding a soft, almost E sound. For example, mat and mать. With so-called palatalization, you need to make your tongue stick to your palate with a bit more area. The consonants before ya, yo, ye, yu, yi are often palatalized. For example, it's один, not один. Определение, not определение. The hard sign is kind of the opposite. It makes sure the consonant stays hard and uninfluenced. It's like a stop sign, stopping the consonant to be palatalized. For example, подъезд is not подъезд. Some Russian consonants flip from voice to voiceless at the end of a word. So for example, garage is spelled with a zh sound at the end, but it's actually pronounced like sh. So it sounds like garage, not garage. It also makes sense because the latter is tiring to pronounce. Garage. Oh my god, it's like you already opened the door and you have to close it in a rush just for something that won't make a big difference. And it works both ways. If a voiceless consonant is followed by a voiced one, it can flip too. It's all part of voicing assimilation. A fancy way of saying Russian consonants like to match the vibe of their neighbors. One thing that helped me realize the difference of pronunciation of Russian native speaker and non-native and especially English native speakers is by watching American movies and series with Russian spies or polyglot stuntmen like John Wick.
У всего сука есть своя цена.
А у этой сука нету.
I found that non-native speakers often ignore the palatalization or mess up the vowel pronunciation. For example, Russian o is like o, not o, ochin, ochin. Since in Russian there's no explicit vowel harmony, most people just mess up the strong u and weak u. And Russian u is strong u. For example, they pronounce labubu
Лабубу, лабубу, лабубу и лабубу.
and YouTube or GPU, and how English speakers pronounce it.
Labubu.
Please say you notice the difference. I believe every language unlocks you to a new way of thinking, and Russian is no exception. In Russian, words change their endings depending on what job they're doing in a sentence. Nouns, pronouns, adjectives, they all get a little outfit change depending on whether they are the subject, the object, or hanging out in the prepositional phrase. This system is called the case system, and it's one of the biggest curveballs for English speakers and potentially other language speakers too. While English relies on word order to make sense of a sentence, like the cat chased the dog or the dog chased the cat, Russian doesn't care as much about order. It cares about endings. The order will only stress the importance of the word. For example, я ем яблоко. The spotlight is on I, the subject. Ем я яблоко is like yelling to your mom who always says you're not having enough greens. The mom ем я яблоко. Of course, it's not recommended to be this rude. Яблоко я ем. The subcontext is like а другие фрукты не люблю. So if you get the endings right, the sentence still makes sense, even if you mix up the word order. But you get the nuance here. I already mentioned the irregular stress patterns which exist together with the case system, so you will have to memorize all of this. If you're a masochist, you will really enjoy learning the language. So the 6 main Russian cases. Let's break it down real quick. Nominative, this one is like the original naked version. It's used for the subject of a sentence. For example, кошка спит, the cat sleeps. Accusative, used for the direct object, the thing being acted on. For example, я вижу компьютер, I see computer. But here's a twist. If the object is alive, the accusative looks like the genitive case, like я встретил друга, I met friend. If it's not alive, it looks like the nominative. Genitive. This case is all about possession, absence, or amounts. For example, у меня нет молока, I don't have milk. Literally, by me, there is no milk. Dative, used when something is being given to someone or done for someone. Я позвонил маме, I called my mom. Literally, I phoned to mom. Instrumental, this one's for the tools and methods. Think with or by means of. Я пишу ручкой, I write with a pen. Prepositional, used after specific prepositions like в, на, о, etc. Я думаю о тебе, I'm thinking about you. There's also a 7th one, the vocative, but it's rare and usually just pops up in emotional or poetic stuff, like yelling someone's name dramatically across the field. Russian nouns follow different declension patterns, depending on gender and spelling. And adjectives, they're not just tagging along, they have to match the noun in gender, number, and case. Verbs also need to match the gender. The verbs don't stop with case changes. Nearly every Russian verb exists in an imperfective and a perfective pair. Imperfective for ongoing, repeated, or incomplete actions. Perfective for finished, one-and-done actions. For example, я читал книгу, I was reading a book, or I used to read a book. Я прочитал книгу, I read the book and finished it. Here's where it gets extra Russian. Imperfective verbs have past, present, and future tenses. Perfective verbs only have past and future because you can't really be completing something in the present. It's either happening or it's done. If you want to say I will read, you've got 2 ways to say it depending on what you mean. Я буду читать, I will be reading. Я прочитаю, I will read and finish it. In Russian, motion verbs can get impressively precise. Not only do you have two types of motion, unidirectional or multidirectional, but these also reflect different meanings even though the base verb is the same. For example, иди is unidirectional, used when someone is going in one direction, typically right now. Ходить is multidirectional, used for habitual actions or when someone goes back and forth. But it gets even more nuanced when you bring in aspect. Combining directionality with imperfective or perfective forms allows for even more specific meanings, like starting, finishing, or repeating the action. And the precision doesn't stop there. Russian has different motion verbs based on how you are moving. For the verb to go, the most common distinctions are идти and ходить, to go on foot, and ехать, ездить, to go by transport, normally non-flying transport. So you can say я иду в магазин, I'm going to the store right now. Я еду в магазин, I'm going to the store, for example, by bus right now. With these combinations of direction, aspect, and mode of transport, Russian motion verbs paint a very detailed picture of how, when, and what manner you're going somewhere. One relief for English speakers is that there are no articles in Russian. In Russian, whether someone means a cat or the cat depends on context, and sometimes one-word order, verb tense, or even which case the noun is in. Here's an example that shows how case endings can give you a clue. Я не вижу книгу, I don't see the book. Я не вижу книги, I don't see a book or any books. The second one uses the genitive case, which often shows up in negative sentences and can imply indefinitiveness, like some book or any book, not a specific one. One unique feature is that in present tense sentences, there's no verb to be. So instead of saying he's a dragon, you say он дракон. There's the naming system, one of the most culturally revealing aspects of Russian identity. Middle names in Russian aren't chosen, they're inherited, and they're patronymic, meaning they come from the father's first name. For sons, the suffix ovich or yevich is added, like Ivanovich, son of Ivan. And for daughters, it's Ovna or Yevna, like Ivanovna, daughter of Ivan. This system doesn't just reflect family lineage, it mirrors the language's deeply gendered structure where names, grammar, and even relationships follow clear masculine and feminine rules. There's also a quirky little pattern in Russian vocabulary. Very few native Russian words start with the letter A. So if you spot a Russian word beginning with A, there's a good chance it's a loan word, borrowed from another language. For example, avtobus comes from French. Arbuz is believed to have come through Persian and possibly Turkic language. Apelsin traces back to Dutch. These words are linguistic footprints showing how Russian has absorbed influences from Western Europe, Asia, and neighboring regions over the centuries. One of Russian's strengths and challenges is how it builds new words. It's a highly morphological language, which means it can take a root word and add prefixes, suffixes, or even combine words to form new ones. This system is powerful and predictable, but it also creates a lot of vocabulary to learn. Prefixes are especially important with verbs. They can change not only the direction or intensity of an action, but also its aspect. For example, ходить is to go on foot, входить is to go in. V means in. The same root gets reinterpreted with a new prefix, and suddenly the meaning changes entirely. This makes Russian highly productive in creating new expressions, but it also means you will encounter many similar-looking verbs with different meanings. So выходить, приходить, уходить, проходить, переходить, заходить, подходить, отходить, сходить, обходить, доходить. Ой, боже. Suffixes, on the other hand, often add nuance or change word categories. For example, учить is to teach, учитель is the teacher, literally one who teaches, thanks to the suffix тель. Diminutives can also be indicated with suffixes, which I'd say is a special feature in Russian. Even vodka is the diminutive form of water, but thank God now Russian uses another diminutive for water to distinguish the alcohol from water. Russian uses compound words too, though not quite as extensively as languages like German. Sometimes they're written with a hyphen. город-герой, человек-паук. You will also see compound adjectives with linking vowels like о or е, краснощёкие, злопамятные. One particularly Soviet-era feature is the use of syllabic abbreviations, acronyms that sound like actual words. ГУЛАГ, Главное управление лагерей. Колхоз, коллективное хозяйство. These blends were part of the bureaucratic language of the time, but many are still used today and give Russian a unique flavor. Russian didn't develop in isolation. Over the centuries, it's absorbed vocabulary from Greek, Latin, French, German, English, Polish, Arabic, Persian, and more. Some of these borrowed words reflect cultural or scientific influence, others mark historic context or political shifts. So once you learn Russian, a whole new world opens up, not just in vocabulary or grammar, but in душе. You will finally be able to experience the words of Pushkin the way he wrote them, full of rhythm, fire, and elegance. You will read Dostoevsky without filters, raw, intense, like stepping into the troubled minds of his characters and walking the snowy streets of 19th century St. Petersburg. You will feel Ivan Bunin's quiet melancholy and poetic grace, not translated, not interpreted, but exactly as he felt them, in the language they were born in. Because in the end, language isn't just a tool for communication, it's a time machine, a portal. It's the only way to meet a writer in their own voice, across centuries, with nothing in between. So if you've ever wanted to feel the pulse of Russian culture, start learning it.